Hey, college students. The future of our democracy urgently depends on us. You can help on-air student leaders curate trusted information on governance and elections and provide an online town square where we can all talk with politicians and each other to find common ground on issues and legislation on us.onair.cc. Our sponsors tonight are Democracy on Air, a nonpartisan nonprofit that supports the U.S. On Air network of 50 governance and election hubs, and GMU Students on Air, which oversees the GMU On Air chapter and the U.S. On Air network.
Good afternoon. My name is Frida Cervantes, and I will be your host for today's Aircast on ranked choice voting. To start off our Aircast, here is a short introductory video on ranked choice voting.
So what is ranked choice voting? In most parts of the United States, voters select a single candidate for each position on their ballot, and the candidate with the most votes wins. This is known as single-choice winner-take-all, which can sometimes result in the election of a candidate who earned only a small percentage of the vote, even when the majority of voters supported other candidates. But that's not the only way of electing our leaders. Ranked choice voting is another voting method which allows voters to rank their candidates in order of preference. In a ranked choice voting election, a candidate needs to earn more than half of the votes to win. All first choices are counted, and if a candidate has a majority, then they win, just like any other election. If not, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who picked that candidate as number one will have their votes count for their next choice. This process continues until a candidate earns a majority and is declared the winner. Let's look at an example. Here, you select orange as your first choice candidate, yellow as your second, pink as your third, and green as your final choice. The first choices are counted. Yellow earned 35%, orange 21%, pink earned 28%, and green earned 16% of the vote. Because nobody won more than 50%, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who picked him as their first choice have their ballots count for their second choice. This continues until a candidate receives more than half of the votes, or 50% plus 1. So what are some of the benefits of ranked choice voting? Ranked choice voting provides more choices, allowing more than two candidates to compete without fear of splitting the vote among like-minded individuals. Sometimes voters feel pressured to vote for the lesser of two evils. Ranked choice voting allows people to vote for their favorite candidate, not just against the candidates they dislike. With ranked choice voting, we see more positive campaigns and less negative advertising. Candidates are encouraged to reach out to as many voters as possible, including those supporting their opponents. They can build a winning coalition with like-minded candidates to earn voters' second and third choices. It's time to fix our democracy and make our elections work better for everybody. We can do that with ranked choice voting. Visit www.fairvote.org to find out how you can get involved.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. How are we all doing today?
Doing well.
Awesome.
Doing well.
Likewise. So to start off our Aircast, I'm just gonna have a question that's open-ended to everyone here. Which types of candidates do you expect to benefit from ranked choice voting?
You can, or I can start off. I think that the candidates that would be most likely to benefit from a ranked choice voting system are ones that would otherwise lose because of their party affiliation, ones that maybe tend to be more moderate in comparison to other members of their party, but because of their party attachment, they're unlikely to procure the votes of their likewise moderate constituents. So maybe in a ranked choice voting system, it could be possible that those kind of people, their appeal goes up, and people are more interested in splitting their ticket and voting for people who they feel better represent them. Because I think a lot of the time people mention that I think for most people, there's not a single political party that represents you 100%. I think that's pretty much impossible because of the variety of topics covered and such like that. So I think for the majority of people, they probably have some positions that are represented by like the left and some positions that are maybe represented by the right. But in our current system, there's just nothing you can do about that, right? You either vote one candidate or the other, one party or the other, or you abstain, right? Or maybe you're voting third party. But so it can feel, I think, as a voter, pretty difficult if you are one of those people who feels like, okay, there's some people who I believe in here and other people I believe in there, but right now there's nothing I can do. And I think maybe a ranked choice voting system could help those people out and actually give them almost a platform to be more successful in getting elected.
I agree. I think also in some ways it could help with the polarization as well. I'm gonna choose Ani. How do you feel? Would you agree with Ben's consensus on some candidates benefiting from ranked choice voting, or would you disagree with that?
Yeah, I would pretty much agree that some candidates have an opportunity to benefit from ranked choice voting. Up for the Democratic candidates who feel that they may not have that the spot or position to kind of succeed in any of these elections. Because if you're going to look at the single choice voting system, you're only given a privilege to vote for one candidate. If you're a citizen and you're walking into the polls looking to vote for a candidate or just indecisive enough on which candidate you want to vote for, ranked choice voting gives you an opportunity to rank the candidates in order of preference. You may agree with one candidate over one area of policy, but disagree over another area. For another candidate, you may agree over all areas of policy, but not agree with maybe just a portion of that area of policy that you agree with. So with ranked choice voting, citizens and residents are given an opportunity to not only vote for just the candidate of their choice, but even have an opportunity to vote for other candidates who they feel have a chance of succeeding in these elections.
Thank you so much. And Devin, I'm going to choose you to kind of side. Would you agree with both either Ani or Ben's thoughts on ranked choice voting benefiting one candidate over the other, or which candidates would benefit from ranked choice voting?
Yeah, I'm very much in line with Ben's perspective. I think moderates would be very popular when it comes to ranked choice voting, especially with the polarization that we're seeing now. In our current system, you're voting one way or the other. You're likely not voting moderate because a lot of moderates believe voting moderately is going to be a wasted vote. I think ranked choice voting will get rid of that. It'll also help get rid of polarization. So yeah, in my mind, moderates would benefit most.
So do we think it's like against political parties' interests, like to have the introduction of ranked choice voting? Do you think?
I don't know if I would say it's against their interest because you're still going to have a Democrat or Republican winning. Maybe it's against establishments. You're not, maybe you, like for a Democrat example, with ranked choice voting, maybe you won't see an establishment Democrat winning the elections like they want. So I guess it could be in some ways, yeah.
Do we see any drawbacks of proposed change brought on by ranked choice voting? In other words, like what would be kind of detrimental to the candidates or political parties brought on by ranked choice voting?
I guess I'll start. One of the most notable drawbacks or say setback behind ranked choice voting is that it's only limited to one political party, and that specifically is the Democratic Party. The Republicans, on the other hand, may feel a little bit, I would say, just not, or just, I mean, like back from this sort of system. Feel that most Republicans, of course, would just denounce ranked choice voting and consider it just as a weird sort of voting system that would benefit the Democrats the most, but hinder the Republicans as well. And honestly, that's one setback or implication behind ranked choice voting, and especially after the fact that with this increased polarization that we saw or 2020 election, if ranked choice voting were to be implemented successfully in all 50 states, and again you're starting to see Republicans resent against the system and generate this whole stop the steal lie, then again this can potentially rejuvenate itself for the upcoming midterm elections. We'll see an increased division between Democrats and Republicans, and a significant majority of Republican politicians themselves will just denounce Democrats for saying, or quote unquote, um, like just cheating in the elections.
I agree with that. I definitely could see kind of that happening. Does anyone else have any proposed ideas of how the drawbacks brought on by ranked choice voting make
One of the drawbacks for me in particular that I don't really like about ranked choice voting is that the person with the most votes can lose. And in my mind, democracy's legitimacy and strength is derived from a majority rule. And so I don't really like the idea that the person with the most votes can lose, even though in our electoral system that still can happen, as we saw in 2016 when Hillary Clinton had the most votes and she ended up losing. I'm just not a fan of that process.
Yeah, I agree with that. Before you had brought up electoral college, I was going to bring that up too. But then, Ben, what were you going to say?
I was gonna say, like, one thing that I think could be a potential negative is that I think ranked choice voting is seen as like, I think ranked choice voting has its upsides, and I think that I think you could argue that it would be more beneficial for the country than our current system. But I do fear that maybe we view it almost as like, I don't think utopia is the right word, but it's like in this position where it seems like, okay, this is the kind of system that will fix all our problems. And my concern is, what if we get in a situation where we do implement this and really we don't see significant change? I feel like we'll be in a worse situation then because we have put a lot of kind of thought into this process and belief that this process will fix a lot of fundamental problems in our electoral system. And so my question is, what if it doesn't? And I think that while ranked choice voting certainly has the capacity to influence polarization in a more positive way, um, I think polarization, we're at such a concerning level of polarization that I'm not sure that even switching to a ranked choice voting system would actually make polarization, significantly better or decrease polarization. I mean, I'm kind of, and it's not to say that I know what would even decrease our polarization. I would suspect, and I guess this is my question for everybody here. Like, do you think that like the average voter, like regardless of political affiliation, is generally in favor of a ranked choice voting system? Like, do you think that is their like base instinct and then it gets influenced by like political party affiliation, like afterwards? Or do
Um,
you think like most people are just not, or like Republicans, like you were mentioning earlier, are just not in favor of it regardless of political affiliation?
I believe, like right now in this day, we are so polarized that some political parties are just kind of untrusting of our current system. So I don't think there's like any like specific trust put into what is kind of a newer topic brought on like with ranked choice voting. So I think it would be kind of the latter what you would say. I think they affiliate more with the party and kind of see what happens from there versus putting kind of all their hope and faith into one system for their best outcome, I would say. Ani and Devin, do you guys have any thoughts on Ben's question?
Yeah,
Um,
I okay, yeah. Yeah, I would say that from what Ben had mentioned, that yes, obviously, ranked choice voting is again ideologically aligned with a political party's interests, that if, over the course of this coming midterm elections, almost all 50 states are going to start implementing this sort of voting system where residents will given an or will be having or be given the privilege to rank whichever candidate they feel they prefer should win the elections. Then I guarantee that the Democrats themselves will have the upper hand in gaining that 50% or reaching that 50% threshold necessary to advance in the elections, while the Republicans, on the other hand, again, will continue to come up with all these conspiracy theories and continuously denounce the whole, the voting system as just weird and even an attempt to Democrats win. So, at the same time, ranked choice voting, first of all, is a good bet, but we would also have to take into consideration some of the limitations or implications that our political parties may experience, particularly the Democrats and the Republicans, um, as per the coming midterm elections when it comes to implementing a system like this.
Devin, what are your thoughts?
I would agree with Ben, and I would kind of go along the lines that Democrats and Republicans probably won't like it very much, kind of along the lines of what I was saying earlier too. So, like for example, when Eric Adams won the Democratic primary for the New York City mayoral race in 2021, I believe, progressives went crazy and pretty much attacked the system and said that ranked choice voting was a gift to moderates, which it probably is, like because we were saying that earlier. And same thing in Alaska with the Republican. There was a House seat, and a notable party member lost to ranked choice voting, and they attacked the system. The Republican Party did, said it was like weird and rigged. So I think another big problem is that people are very unfamiliar with what it is, most Americans, I would say. But they need to become more familiar with it so that when it does get attacked by the parties, they can understand what they're actually saying.
I agree. Ranked choice voting is familiar within other countries, so I think that it's time that Americans may become more familiar with it versus attacking it.
Let me just add one thing. I just want to say that I don't even think like Glenn Youngkin, for instance, in Virginia, like he was nominated using ranked choice voting, if I'm correct, which I believe I am. So it's not like it's this like foreign idea, but it's kind of curious because he won his nomination through ranked choice voting. But I don't think he's like particularly, I don't know what his position as governor is like in general on ranked choice voting. But clearly I think that demonstrates the fact that I mean it works. It can work in both parties to some capacity. So yeah, I don't know. I just want to say that's an example of a Republican that was nominated using that.
Right. So for our next question, so we've already kind of discussed on how kind of the drawbacks that may be brought on by within ranked choice voting, and then kind of the problems that we have in our system today. So does anyone here propose any alternative reforms to ranked choice voting, or in your utopian world, what would you see best fit for our system? And I also want to emphasize the polarization that we face. So what would be kind of our best system that would kind of like tackle the polarization and just overall within our democracy in the United States?
If I could start off here, I think like maybe this isn't exactly answering the question because I'm not about to propose a particular system and instead propose a way to participate in said systems. Like the best type of political participant is generally a disinterested one who tries to like objectively analyze, policies and determine what they view as, the best for them. I think the best way to handle polarization and kind of battle it is like I think as a voter you have to take a step back. You have to disengage your kind of your personality or your like you have to take a step back, remove yourself from the politics. And I think that's really what drives the majority of our polarization is the fact that people's identities are so linked with their political affiliation that it's like their political affiliation is them and they are their political affiliation. And so we get in this situation where certainly there's some individuals who, if you were to say, "Oh, I'm a Democrat," or "I'm a Republican," whatever it may be, that they simply have no interest in even talking with you, about policy, whatever it may be, because of that political affiliation. I mean, I think that is a major death of democracy if we get to this point where we can't even discuss things like that. So I think if we as voters can try and disengage ourselves like emotionally with the emotional side of politics and try and I don't know, just try and view it more objectively. I think it would do a lot for decreasing polarization in our country. And that's not a specific system. That's kind of like maybe treating a symptom of polarization. But I really do think like it would be beneficial for our system in the long run.
Ani, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would just like to second what Ben had mentioned, that if we can disengage, participants with these elections into believing or into making them believe whomever they're voting for in this coming election does not align with something that is more personal to them or something they feel is, or historically been a major threat to them, then I would pretty much concur with the fact that we can reform the ranked choice voting system and allow residents to instead vote for candidates on a more objective basis rather than on a subjective purpose. Because if we're going to vote for whoever will be contesting for this coming election subjectively, then there's this sense, degree of polarization that will start to foment. And at the same time, if there's further polarization between both political parties, and if there's further disagreements that continue to ensue between Democrats and Republicans, then pretty soon this coming midterm election, we'll start to see dramatic changes that have been ones that we haven't seen since 2016. And in the next 2 to 4 years, but by the time we hit 2024, when the presidential elections are held, we'll pretty much see an end to democracy. Democracy does not focus on polarization or focus on, which political party benefits or which political interests tend to benefit one's country. Focuses more on inclusivity and equality, promoting just the rule of law and encouraging every individual, regardless of their political affiliations or beliefs or ideological interests, to vote for whichever candidate and whomever will be the representative who can save this democracy and, more importantly, represent this country overseas. Obviously, the midterm elections itself are at stake for determining whether our democracy will stay or decline devastatingly. And if we're going to implement this sort of choice voting system necessary to save this democracy, it would be substantial enough for these for election commissions to encourage or insist presidents themselves to take it more objectively and not take it subjectively.
Thank you. I just kind of want to touch on what you said, that democracy is not necessarily about polarization, but I personally believe that polarization, especially today, is kind of what is kind of a big threat to our democracy today. And there's also this general idea within the public, and maybe because ranked choice voting is kind of a complex, newer reform that many people aren't used to, but there's this idea that it may result in more democratic outcomes. So do you think that ranked choice voting is susceptible to strategic manipulation, or how would you go on about that?
In terms of, so I just wanted to clarify, you're talking about manipulation and ranked choice voting?
That's because, yeah. Because you said
okay,
that.
So,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
It's fine, yeah. So I would believe that ranked choice voting itself is kind of a form of strategic manipulation, where you're kind of manipulating one group of individuals affiliated with a specific political party over another, which in turn increases the level of subjectivity within our voter participant community. And that, I believe, is not essentially the way towards commissioning and even hosting elections like these, because from previous elections themselves, specifically 2013 election or even 2008, there hasn't been any sort of manipulation that has been implemented by election commissions on McCain's coalition in 2008 and Obama's group in the 2008 elections. And if election commissions across a variety of across 50 states in the United States start using this sort of ranked choice system as a form of manipulation, where they're favoring one audience and neglecting the other, then what's the point of having a democracy? It's not about manipulating audience or manipulating a specific group over another, regardless of their political affiliations. Is about including or encouraging every individual to come and vote for which candidate will be the most credible representative, not only represent their state, but for 2024 represent the country and represent this country in the world.
Awesome, thank you. And Devin, I wanted to ask you, just because I didn't get a chance to ask you, what would you, if you could propose kind of a reform, kind of alternative to ranked choice voting, kind of in your own utopian world? Because you did express earlier that one thing that you don't like about ranked choice voting is that it is kind of the antithesis of democracy, given that if a person, a candidate with the most votes may not win in the ranked choice voting system.
Yeah, so I don't know what the right answer is. I think that ranked choice voting is probably going to be a better system in eradicating polarization. I still think there'll be polarization. I think polarization in democracies is kind of part of democracy, to be honest. I think we'd have to look at, Maine and New York City, and I believe Nebraska does ranked choice voting to kind of see what the kinks are and work them out. I don't think it's a perfect system, and I don't think a perfect system exists, but I think ranked choice voting is a step in the right direction.
I I just want to kind of say something to what Ani was saying earlier. I actually think that probably almost any form of government actually does rely on manipulation of its voters. And I think that is like necessarily true because generally the reason that people vote is either through an appeal to their emotions, maybe it be religious, their moral beliefs, whatever it may be. So I think like that kind of manipulation is like necessarily exists within the system. Like you have to find some way to convince like voters. Like it has to be something, whether it be their emotions or maybe their more objective analysis of a situation. Like regardless, I still think you're trying to find ways to appeal to those people. Yeah, that's all I want to say on that.
Yeah, I would agree with your idea on how you're trying to use manipulation to appeal to manipulate a specific voter audience to have them appeal to any candidate that is contesting. But I wouldn't necessarily believe that we're going to be using manipulation as a form of subjective tool, and that voters themselves are going to be leveraging manipulation used by political parties to kind of just act biased against which candidate, against a specific candidate, who others feel may be best preferable to govern their specific state, but for the case of one political faction or one group of voter participants aligned with that political faction, would uh, would be a candidate that they disagree with. And I wouldn't necessarily believe that if we're going to use manipulation for purposes of subjectivity, then that's not necessarily the importance of democracy. We're not, for democracy itself, we're not using manipulation for subjective purposes to favor one candidate over another. We can manipulate a specific audience based on their preferences, based on their beliefs religiously, and even based on appeal itself and credibility purposes as well, but not purpose of being subjective over one candidate just because aligned with political ideologies or interests that are completely contrary to what those voters themselves believe in.
Okay, I think you bring up a really interesting point because I actually completely disagree. And I think issue framing is the reason I disagree. I think that democracy only functions properly if one votes within their best interest, okay? So the question that needs to be asked then is, are voters voting in their own best interest? And the way that you would determine that is the individual themselves needs to be able to determine what their best interest is and then act on that. I would argue that the prevalence of issue framing today, whether that be through the media, I think the largest predictor of how one votes is how their family votes, right? I mean, I think we have a very legitimate question to say, okay, these people who are voting, the same way as their parents, are they recognizing their own self-interest and voting accordingly? And I would say the answer is no to that. Sure, in some instances, yeah, like they happen to be voting within their best interest. But I would say that a vast majority of the time, the answer is probably no. And so with issue framing, I think the problem comes is that if we're at this point in time where people are not only not able to recognize their own self-interest as a result of issue framing, they're certainly not voting in it. They're actually voting in the opposite of their interest. What do we do? And I actually think that, along with polarization, are the two biggest threats to democracy. And I think that like that is kind of going back to my point where you have to start to become a disinterested like political participant, is because so much of that like influence on your preferences comes from like either your family or like media. I think the media plays a massive role now in molding how people like their political beliefs. And I think that is the subjective manipulation that occurs, and that is the driving factor behind probably like I think probably over 70% of voters, their beliefs probably stem not from like their own analysis of themselves, and instead from these outside sources. And it's like, how is a democracy supposed to function under those conditions? I don't think it does.
Ani, do you want to take a step back at that?
In terms of media itself, yes, I would yeah, media plays an important role behind manipulation. That you need media, you need any forms of uh, you know you know coverage itself necessary to convince a specific voting popular specific voter participant group that you vote for this candidate because this will be the best fit for these coming elections and will be the best representative to, or be the best individual to represent you for this country. However, in terms of issue framing itself, I mean, if we're going to use media or any of those sorts of tools to manipulate a specific group over let's say over a candidate's experience or qualifications itself, then that's not how democracy itself. You can vote for a candidate they believe whatever issues that they're tackling will be the best fit to eradicate some of those concerns you have, but taking a step back from from issues itself and focusing and instead looking at qualifications. If you're going to say that, or if you're going to vote for a specific candidate whom you believe is much more qualified than another, and if you use media and all those tools to kind of manipulate a specific audience to make them believe that, oh, this candidate is unqualified and you should vote for this person B instead, then that's not democracy. Everybody has an individual right to vote for whomever is most fit and whichever candidate they feel is the best representative for themselves. Look at the UK itself, entirely, and specifically the general elections post Johnson's resignation between Truss and Sunak. A majority of South Asians themselves who voted for Sunak were never denied the ability to vote for him, and yet he received this majority of votes despite losing that general election. But at the same time, it all bogs down to the idea of, regardless of whichever qualifications an individual has, or whichever ethnicity or racial group that individual comes from, they're nevertheless the representative, or let's say a candidate for this coming election. Every individual and citizen has the right to vote for them. You cannot deny one's rights to vote for that candidate based on their qualifications, nor can you use all these sorts of tools like media and press and even news publications to manipulate a specific audience and convincing them, saying that, oh, this candidate is bad, you shouldn't vote for him, vote for person B instead. because that's not how democracy in the United States encompasses.
Thank you. Devin, did you want to take a stab kind of siding with either Ani or Ben and their agreements?
Yeah, I think Ben brought up a really good point in issue framing, and I think something that we're ignoring is when it comes to issue framing, that's how I believe political parties, not necessarily candidates, get votes, because they're very good at with all the money that they have, they're very good at using the media to manipulate and pull on the emotional strings of their voters and pull them in the direction of maybe what's not necessary in their own self-interest, like Ben was saying. So I think that's a huge issue for democracies across the world. And I really don't see that going away with ranked choice voting either. I think that's still going to be a big issue with especially how much money flows into media and marketing for political parties.
As just like a last closing thought from me, I'll pose this question. Do you think like voters then, so if, like Brexit, for instance, because you started talking about the UK, it's very likely that a fair few supporters of the Brexit decision, like were not completely aware of the effects on themselves, like either economic or travel related, whatever it may be. Do you think that the people who voted in favor of it, but without understanding the effects on themselves, is that an example of democracy working properly or democracy failing, in your opinions?
I guess I'll start that the people, your example of the people voting in favor of Brexit, even if they had completely, absolutely zero idea of what Brexit was and how and the implications behind Brexit is not necessarily what democracy encompasses. Democracy, yes, encourages inclusivity and equality of all, but at the same time, those residents must have the ability to represent themselves as a well-informed citizen. The UK, for example, if you're going to have if like 75% or maybe 50% of a specific residential population in all districts in London and other parts of the UK start voting in favor of an extremely controversial incentive like Brexit without having zero idea on the aftershocks or the implications of that Brexit created towards the UK and their systems, then what's the point of having democracy if you're going to have 50% of residents um, vote for a really controversial issue that they absolutely have zero idea about. Democracy entirely encourages residents to be well informed, to be not only well engaged within their systems, but to have a substantial level of knowledge over how our systems work, how our democracy functions, and how our elections and any form of governance systems we have in our country play out. And this is essentially kind of the case for other flourishing democracies in Northern Europe or maybe in Asia, particularly India, where a majority or like percent in the 2019 general elections of Indian residents who voted for to be reelected for a second term were well informed over some of the issues, but domestically and even internationally that India was experiencing, specifically when it comes to inflation and any of those economic crises or domestic terrorism in Kashmir and conflicts with Pakistan and skirmishes with China. More than 75% of those who voted for Modi were well informed over all those events and issues that have been unfolding on India's domestic front. And that essentially is the goal behind democracy. We want to encourage individuals and residents to vote, not only to be well engaged, but vote in a way that they're well informed of those specific legislations or their specific policies, whether controversial or non-controversial, but that occur within our country. Because if we're going to unnecessarily for something that we have no idea about, and pretty soon, and then once it starts getting implemented, these aftershocks start to create, and get and we also become vulnerable from that. Then I feel that it's not necessarily what democracy is about, and those signs themselves or those indications specifically are essentially signs that democracy can be failed.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that, what you said about a well-informed citizen. So with a lot of people not knowing what could happen, the repercussions, I think it's kind of like a failure of democracy. Just wanted to echo what Ani had said.
I'll follow up to answer your question, but I think supranational organizations like the EU affect institutions more than they affect the individual. And I think the institutions in the UK really wanted out of the EU. And so with all the money that they had, they utilized political manipulation very well, and kind of got individual citizens on their side to vote to leave the EU. So I think that's a big problem again with voter manipulation.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any last closing and final thoughts on our discussion about today?
No.
All right, so this concludes our Aircast. Thank you so much for our insightful discussions and our thoughts brought on today. Thank you. Have a lovely rest of your day.
You can learn more about the US On Air network by going to us.onair.cc and select one of the About posts. You can find a video recording of this Aircast in our US and Virginia On Air YouTube channels and in VA On Air posts.